Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those on the West Coast. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Cannabis Business Times. This is how to utilize control systems to maximize yield. We are pleased to welcome an expert from Anden who will share strategies to help you better understand how to use control systems to minimize risk and maximize the quality of your yield. Today's speaker from Anden is sub-brand April Air, a company whose history dates back to 1938. Indoor air quality control in America. They're headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin, and its business strategies include expertise in analyzing, configuring, and recommending tailored dehumidification and humidification solutions and products based on individual customer needs. Before I introduce today's speaker, just a couple quick notes. There is a question box. It should be off to the right of your screen. So feel free to drop any questions in there as the webinar is going on. I'll be sort of gathering those questions together and asking them for the end of today's presentation. Also, this webinar will be archived, so if you have to leave anytime, that's fine. An email will be sent out to everyone who registered with a link to view the webinar later on. With that said, I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker, Brandon Glancy, Channel Manager for Anden. He's been with the company for about 9 years, and he started the controlled environment agriculture sector and the Anden brand of April Air. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, morning, etc. Like we already said to everybody, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy days to hear what we have to say today. Hopefully we can give you some information that you can use. I guarantee you're going to have some fun with it. There's a lot of information that we're going over today. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. We'll answer as many of them as we can. And as always, we are available to you offline as well. So in order to save time, because we got some information to cover, I'm going to dive right into this today. And I'm going to start by kind of explaining to you who we are, what we do, and how we got here. So our goal at Anden was to help cultivators maximize yields by combining our horticultural knowledge with environmental control expertise. Being that we on the April Air side had been doing this for so long, over 80 years, we had a lot of HVAC contractors that, as grows were going up across North America, were counseling through us to find out how to best control humidity inside of these spaces. And what we realized really quickly was that the agricultural world, as it becomes larger and as there are more and more intricacies to it, was really outpacing the capacities and capabilities of modern humidity control systems. So we made it our mission to not only understand the environment well, but understand the plants well, so that we could understand how both react to each other and give people the best information possible and provide them with the best solutions. We work very hard to ensure that we are at the cutting edge of the knowledge, the products, the application, and the installation and support for you at all times. To give you an idea, before we even made one product, we spent an entire year with cultivators, hundreds of growers, engineers, facility designers, and we included them in the design process of everything that we do. And that was crucial to being able to be coming out with these control solutions and room dehumidification techniques that were going to not just solve problems, not just control humidity, not just prevent white powdery mildew, etc., but actually drive the environment to a point where you can affect positively the yield and quality of the product that you're producing. And it started with something very simple. We were talking in a room one day with a cultivator, and he talked to me about the best chocolate cake recipe ever. I thought this was great. And he said, if I give you this right in front of you, the best chocolate birthday cake ever, here's all the ingredients, here's how you bake it, here's how long you cook it for. Do you think you're going to make me the best chocolate birthday cake that I've ever had? And I said, well, it seems pretty straightforward, right? We have the ingredients, we have the temperatures that we got to cook at, we have the type of things we got to cook in, and we got the amount of time we got to cook it for. He goes, that never will give you the best chocolate cake. You have all the ideas, but if you don't have the right equipment, if you don't have the right oven that can consistently give you the temperatures, you're going to end up with cakes that are different. Sometimes you're going to get a bad cake like the one on the left. Sometimes you're going to get a good bake like the one on the right. But it all comes down to consistency. We need equipment that we can rely on, and we need products that we know are going to do what they do, and we need control strategies that will allow us to take the environment that we know we want and create it so that we can grow the type of cannabis that we're looking to grow. And that was really eye-opening to us. It was that idea of we can create the mathematics that create the music, but the artistry behind the song, that's you, that's the cultivator, and that's the piece that's missing. And it's not a one-size-fits-all conversation because every single room is going to be very different. It's all about balancing those rooms. Every variable needs to be accounted for. I have been in grows from the very, very small to the very, very large. I have seen temperatures that ranged 5, 6, 7 degrees from floor to ceiling. Humidity that looked like it was fine if you looked at the sensors that were surrounding the room. But when you measured inside the canopy, humidity was out of control. Rooms where they thought they were dehumidifying, but they never were able to flip the VPD, so the plants were never able to open up and transpire moisture the way that they wanted to. All of this is something that we can actually control. And by controlling this, we can create and maximize these wonderful yields, but there's more to it than just looking at the room. I'll give you an example. We called this the Shango problem. Shango is a grower that we are partnered with who had a problem with the dehumidification equipment that they were using. They were never capable of getting their rooms down to where they wanted it to go. This little graph, boring though it may be, gives you an idea of what they were dealing with. When their lights were on, they would start their dehumidifiers a little early, and it would start to dry their room out the way that they wanted to have. What would happen, though, is the lights turned off, their dehumidifiers, even though the math said they should keep up, were never capable of keeping up. Not only did they not keep up with the humidity in the room, but the humidity in the room wildly outpaced what those dehumidifiers were capable of doing. Well, through industry connections, they finally invited the Anden team and our engineers out to their facility in order to see if we could help them solve that problem. And this was something that taught us a lot of valuable lessons as it pertained to controlling a grow inside of this industry. We knew how the plants were going to react. We knew how to change the humidity levels in order to flip the VPD. We understood what we needed to do in order to get them to drink. These were all factors that your average dehumidification company doesn't take into consideration, and it's why you've seen so many people, and maybe yourselves have experienced this as well, who have put the correct amount of dehumidifiers inside of the room for all intents and purposes. Everything looked like it should be fine, but then when you flipped the switch and you actually started growing, you realized you needed more, and you needed more. So you added 1 or 2. Then you added a rolling dehumidifier in and out in order to compensate. I'm here to tell you that's not something that you need to do. We can figure out a room incredibly well if we are controlling it right, if we're measuring it correctly, and if we understand what the needs of the plants are inside of that room. Because that's what's going to drive whether or not the room is successful. It's not the environment around it. It's way that the plants are feeling inside of that room. The beautiful thing about that is plants are very predictable. Now, there's a lot of factors that you have to look at when you're talking about these plants. The growing medium is going to be a factor. Are you using coca? Are you using a water table? These are all things that you need to understand when you're doing this, but we can understand how the plants are going to react and what makes those plants decide to transpire moisture and what makes them decide to keep that moisture in. And without explaining every single one of these graphs, because they're infinitely boring and they look like a bunch of squiggly lines, what I can tell you is when you marry that horticultural expertise with that environmental control expertise, you are capable of actually changing a room and making a room do exactly what you want it to do. Now, I wish it was as simple as telling you that this is something that you're going to be able to figure out on pen and paper and you're going to be able to make everything in your room look, fantastic. The truth is it's not. It's why we have an engineering team that is at your disposal at no charge to help walk you through what needs to happen in your rooms in order to make sure we're getting you the best results possible. The truth of the matter is facts are stubborn things. Get the right data out there to change the way that a room works. And as you can see, just looking at these two graphs right here again, you don't got to understand what the squiggly lines are, but look at the way a temperature fluctuation occurs inside of an average room over the course of several weeks, and look how that impacts the relative humidity. In an ideal world, we're keeping a very singular line, a nice sloping line that was going to make these grows work the way that we intend them to. In the real world, I'm sorry to report, plants don't behave the way that you want them to all the time. So what we need to do is understand how to calculate those variables and what we can do in order to change it. And it's more about just balancing the room, because the room can feel wildly different to you than it does to your actual plant. Perfect example, I was with an LP in Ontario just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sitting inside of their room, and he's showing me about how wildly his room is balanced compared to the average grower. He has chillers in this room, he has dehumidifiers in this room, he has steam humidifiers in this room. Excuse me, sorry, we've got a phone ringing in here. And he has different lighting controls in this room. So again, sorry about the phone ringing there, but we have steam humidifiers, dehumidifiers, chillers, everything in order to balance the room. The reason was the room and where the sensors and everything were for the room were not what was controlling how that room felt. He had actually embedded sensors in the canopies of each one of his plants in their respective tables and areas in order to ensure that they were balancing what the plant was feeling like. Because the difference in his room between where the plant was and where the sensors were was 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which resulted in an 8% relative humidity swing. That can be the difference between having a consistent, good, high-quality yield or having things like white powdery mildew. So what we were working with them to do, and what we will work with everybody to do, is help correct the canopy temperatures versus the room temperatures, which will help balance the relative humidity versus the way the relative humidity feels in the room. It's all about making sure that the plant feels the way it needs to, not that the room feels the way that it needs to. And if we do that over time, and we can accurately calculate the correct temperature for growing and the correct amount of water for that grow based upon what your individual recipes are, we can really well control a room and massively increase the yield. And you do that by having equipment that can modulate with the temperatures inside of the room, and you combine that with measurement devices that are capable of measuring inside the canopies, not around the canopies, so that you are sure that you are flipping the VPD where the plants are, not just balancing out that room. I cannot stress that enough. If you are measuring your rooms and not measuring your plants, you are not getting the yield, and it's just simple math, that you possibly could. And it's a big factor for everybody who's growing. Most people put a sensor on a wall or two and think that that's the way to go. More often than not, you're seeing people switch that over now to actually dangling sensors inside of those plants, and you accurately measure those variables in order to change the way the room works. So in the instance of the Shango facility, where they had started with a former company, was they were using 10 dehumidifiers, because that company told them 10 dehumidifiers. That was what you needed in order to be able to manage that room. And for a year, they tried and could not get it done. The dehumidifiers handled the spike when the actual lights turned off. But as those plants opened up and tried to transpire moisture, those dehumidifiers and where they were measuring the water was not at the canopy. They were measuring outside. They were actually measuring at the dehumidifier. So the dehumidifiers did not have the capacity because the room wasn't sized correctly, because not all the variables were taken into account. And they weren't controlling them correctly, so by the time the dehumidifiers turned back on, the room had already had too much humidity in it, and the dehumidifiers could not get control of the capacity of that room until the air conditioner kicked back on in order to help them out. That's not what you want. That affects your yield negatively. When we came in, we first measured and we were looking at it, and we said perhaps 12 dehumidifiers were going to do it. So we ran the math, and what we found out was 12 dehumidifiers were going to handle the spike and flip the VPD, meaning the plants were going to open up and breathe that beautiful humidity back into the air so that they could uptake their nutrients. But eventually that plant transpiration was going to overcome the capacity. It ended up being that if you were going to control that VPD and keep those plants for the entire lights off cycle, expelling moisture the way that they wanted it to, you were going to need 14 dehumidifiers in order to do it. That was going to handle the spike, flip the VPD, and keep up with the plants as they expelled all of their moisture. And there is such a thing as too many dehumidifiers. If you added 16 dehumidifiers. So if you add an additional 2, you're actually not going to give you any benefit. You were actually dehumidifying, even though we can lower the humidity down to a lower percentage, it wasn't providing any benefit to plant growth. So there is a calculation that can be done. Again, we're here to help you with that. Don't feel like you're there to do that on your own. We will walk you through the math. You'll have to provide us with information and we will help you get there. We're calling that the Goldilocks effect. Too few dehumidifiers and your plants don't transpire enough. Too many and you're going to over dry them. No benefits to that. But if you find it just right, that Goldilocks zone, not only can you change the way that room feels, you can change the way your plants grow inside of that room. You can get incredible results from that. At the end of this webinar, you will have a link to our website that you can write down, and you can actually hear the entire Shango team talk about the replacement of their dehumidifiers, the inclusion of the Anden dehumidifiers, and the phenomenal results they received in both increase in yield and quality once we got their room accurately controlled. So don't take our word for it, talk directly to the source. So it's about more than just getting that room under balance. You know, having the ideas and understanding how to do it is one thing, but then it's about having the type of equipment that is capable of doing this. And as I spent my first year inside of this agricultural world looking at dehumidifiers and controls, it became very clear to us very, very quickly that everybody who was using a dehumidifier that was based upon the way dehumidifiers had been designed for the home, which was everybody, was missing a crucial component in how agricultural dehumidification needs are met. And that crucial component was a dehumidifier that's been designed around working inside of your house, meaning it was spec'd to 80 degrees and 60% relative humidity. Those dehumidifiers are meant to keep a human being comfortable. They're meant to keep a basement or an attic from growing mold. And they're not meant to keep up with the massive amount of moisture that a grow room will produce. Furthermore, they were never designed to change their operating temperature. So what does that mean for you? A dehumidifier that's made to run at 80 degrees and 60% relative humidity, that is the best that dehumidifier will ever run. So what do dehumidifier companies do? They build dehumidifiers that look really, really good at 80 degrees and 60% relative humidity. The byproduct of building something that works really good at 80 degrees is if you run cooler than 80 degrees, if you run 75, if you run 72, your dehumidifier's capacity falls through the floor. And that's why so many of you and so many growers out there have had the need to add dehumidifiers as they went along their lives. It wasn't because you did the math wrong. It wasn't because you underestimated how much dehumidification you needed. It was because your dehumidifier said it would do 200 pints per day, but in the real world, when you put it inside your grow, it actually only did 160. And that is something that we wanted to address right away. And there is a good way that you can do that. The first thing you need to do in order to make sure that you've got a dehumidifier that's going to work inside of a grow, and that you've got control over your growth so that you can make sure that you're getting the type of results that you can see in the Shango video, is having a control system that is accurate. Now, a lot of cultivators that we work with get secondary control systems. I love that because some of those secondary control systems are incredible. They're incredibly precise. They allow you to run sensors into the canopy. I cannot stress this enough. Always measure your plants at the canopy. Do not ever, 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 ever allow your dehumidifiers to measure humidity where they're installed. First of all, if you hang your dehumidifier and it's by lights, and a lot of people run 1,000-watt double-end sodium bulbs, those ballasts give off heat. And if you change the amount of heat that dehumidifier is measuring, you're changing the amount of relative humidity that dehumidifier thinks is in your room. The warmer the air, the lower the relative humidity, okay? So if your room at the plants is 75 degrees, and it is at 75 degrees, 60% relative humidity, and your dehumidifier is mounted up at the ceiling by those lights, and your dehumidifier thinks it's 80 degrees because of the heat giving off by the lights and where it's measuring the temperature is at the dehumidifier, your dehumidifier doesn't see that room at 60% relative humidity because you have a 5-degree difference in temperature. So the relative humidity, according to the dehumidifier, is lower. Depending upon the accuracy of the dehumidifier's control, it will measure something around the range of between 58% down to 52%. What does that mean? In the real world, that means your dehumidifier might think your room is fine, and in the meantime, your plants are suffering because there's too much moisture in that room, and you can get white powdery mildew, or worse, if there is a worse. So accuracy of control is crucial, and placement of control is crucial. So we include one in every box. So if you don't have the desire or the want, or to put in these massive, $30,000, $40,000 control systems, but you still want the accuracy of control, you can use what we use because they're included in every box. That's important. Those controls are 70% more accurate than the industry standard, because at the end of the day, we don't want to be the cause for you not getting the best yield possible. So control is important. Second, you have to understand how a dehumidifier was meant to operate. So to give you a little history check on this, back in 1967, the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers, AHAM, comes up with the rating for dehumidifiers. And they said the dehumidifier needs to be rated at 80 degrees Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity. So when you hear a dehumidifier company say they do 130 pints per day, or 225 pints per day, or 300 pints per day, they're telling you that that's what that dehumidifier does if it's 80 degrees and 60% relative humidity. Every degree you are in temperature less than 80 degrees, and every percent that you are lower than 60% relative humidity, that dehumidifier's capacity drops. Some of them drop drastically, okay? So when you're looking at a dehumidifier, do not take pints per day at face value. What else does that mean? That means energy efficiency on a dehumidifier is not as good as it claims. And energy efficiency is dramatically affected by temperature and relative humidity as well. So if you have a dehumidifier that says, oh, we got this great energy rating at 80 degrees, if you take that dehumidifier down to 75, guess what? Your energy rating drops dramatically. But for better or worse, every dehumidifier company has to rate at 80-60. So every company builds dehumidifiers to go at 80-60. Every company until Anden came along. I'll give you a good example of this in the real world. The Ideal Air dehumidifier is incredibly honest with its ratings. Whether you like them or not, whether you think they're good or bad, it doesn't matter. They're telling you right on their box how temperature and humidity affects their pints per day. Most people don't bother to look at the box that closely, but it's a big chart right on the box, where they will tell you that their DS190, 190 pint dehumidifier will get you 190 pints per day if you are growing at 86 degrees and 80% relative humidity. If you drop that temperature down to 80-60, AHAM, notice they've got the note right on their box, that doesn't do 190 pints per day. It does 15. If you drop it down to 70 degrees, it only does 70. So you may think to yourself, I need 600 pints of removal. I'm going to buy 3 Ideal Airs, and you may only be getting 200 pints removal depending upon the temperature you're growing at. There is a way to manage this, and it comes with designing a dehumidifier that was designed to modulate as temperatures modulate. You're never going to prevent a dehumidifier from losing capacity as temperature changes. It's just physics. But you can change the rate at which the capacity drops. More importantly, if you do it the right way, you can increase the amount of dehumidification at certain temperatures that are tuned in with agriculture, which is exactly what we did. We added 3 components to these dehumidifiers in order to allow you to control that room more precisely. An industrial grade compressor that was meant to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a high quality TXV, which is a refrigerant metering device, and a crankcase heater, which will allow your refrigerant to stay in its gas form. The fact of the matter is, the humidity spikes first, not only, but first when those lights turn off. And you need that dehumidifier to achieve full capacity quickly, or you're just flat out wasting money. A crankcase heater allows a dehumidifier to reach maximum capacity in minutes. Most dehumidifiers take 30, 40 minutes. We can do that in a handful of minutes, okay? That's important inside of a grow room because your plants, whether it's 4 of them or 400 of them, aren't going to wait for your dehumidifier to reach capacity before they start doing their thing. They're going to do your thing, and your equipment's got to be what keeps up with them. So that's one of those things that were crucial with getting this dehumidifier running. The second thing was that TXV valve is there. TXV valve is very redundant, by the way. The TXV was there to modulate the amount of refrigerant moving through your dehumidifier system. What does that mean? As you cool off your grow to simulate fall, crash that temperature to get the best yield possible. Our dehumidifier actually moves additional refrigerant through its refrigeration system in order to help supplement the amount of temperature that you're removing and get more humidity out of the air at a colder temperature. So in the real world, our dehumidifiers hold capacity longer and have a much smaller reduction in capacity as opposed to a standard dehumidifier. That's important for accuracy. The third challenge is your crop itself is designed to make a dehumidifier underperform. Everything in that room is designed to challenge a dehumidifier from doing what it needs to do. Same thing with your air conditioner. If you're not using a high quality filtration system on your air conditioner, get out there today and get one because it's costing you money if you're not. 2 quality components a dehumidifiers got to have to survive your room. They got to have an ECM blower and they got to have a high quality coated coil. But that ECM blower is beyond important. It is crucial to making a dehumidifier work. See, dehumidifiers are only as good as the amount of air moving through them. If you're not passing air through that dehumidifier can't remove water from that air. So what an ECM blower allows you to do is, as your filter and your dehumidifier loads up with particulate, there's plenty of particulate floating around these rooms, no matter how clean you have them. The plants themselves are shedding particulate, okay? As that filter loads up and that filter becomes harder and harder for air to move through, every other dehumidifier on the market's capacity drops. It drops because their blower cannot compensate and continue to move as much air across the coil as it did when that air filter was clean and brand new. Our dehumidifier, that fan speeds up. It keeps its RPMs moving in order to ensure that you're always getting the same amount of CFM across that coil, no matter how dirty that filter gets. Because it's not good enough that your dehumidifier does its capacity the first day you install it. You want that dehumidifier to be doing the same capacity in 3 weeks, in 9 weeks, in 2 years, in 5 years. That's what an ECM blower does. So it's going to help you maintain that consistency and that capacity. And then finally, a coated coil is just, it has to be there. Every nutrient you put in the soil, every fertilizer that you throw inside the ground is designed to eat away at a coil of an air conditioning system and a coil of a dehumidifier. And if you're bringing air across that coil and your coil is not protected against chemicals, that coil is going to fail. I cannot tell you how many times I walked into a grower and they had a dehumidifier no longer working on the side of the room because it was rusted out. And it was rusted out because it was never protected against the elements. And that's what these coils are designed to do. And our specific coil protects against 90 more corrosive elements than any other one. So if you don't have these 6 components, you cannot say that your dehumidifier is designed to work in a grow room, because as we explained, each one of these individual components is there specifically to counteract a hurdle that your growing room is going to put in front of the dehumidifier. And if you do all 6 of these things, you're going to end up with incredible controllability over your grow, which in the end, I believe is what everybody wants. But what does that translate to in the real world? Well, if you do components the right way and you run at growing conditions, and the average growing condition that we've had after talking to thousands of cultivators is about 75 degrees and 55% relative humidity. That's not all day, every day. That's just the average, right? Some go down to 72. I've had some go down into the 60s, but the average is 75. So at 75, 55, the dehumidifiers that we make have about 13% drop off of their listed capacity, meaning we say they do 300 pints a day at 80-60 because of those components and the way our dehumidifier works. At a grow room, they still do 260 pints per day. How does that stack up against competition? I'm not going to name any names, but the industry's leading 225 pint dehumidifier at 80-60 does do 225 pints. At 75-55, they have a 27% drop off in performance. Their energy factor goes from fantastic to not so good. And every time you lower that temperature or you lower that percentage of relative humidity, it gets worse and worse. For them, we hold that line. So in a room that has 200 gallons worth of feed rate, you need 8 of their dehumidifiers to do the same job that we can do with 5. And that's just capacity. That doesn't even account for the fact that the controls are 70% more accurate, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot you can do, and you can do it really well. And it doesn't have to cost you a fortune. You just got to do it and look at it the right way. And if you measure and you take into account all the environmental variables in the beginning, you can make that leap to the right solution right away. By the way, every one of our pieces of equipment, while I'm talking about them, 5-year bumper-to-bumper warranty. Field repairable. You never have to pull something off the ceiling and send it back. Worst case scenario, say a refrigeration system malfunctions, which knock on wood, we haven't had one fail yet, but if they do, and they will, it's mechanical, something's going to go wrong. You just pick up a brand new dehumidifier free of charge from your local distributor and put it right up. You don't got to ship that one back. You don't got to wait for an RMA. You don't got to wait for a refrigeration repair. Our goal is to make sure nobody is down, if we can help it, a day. And that's the important part. How can we do that? We actually have life testing machines. The average life expectancy of an Anden dehumidifier is 14 years. Why? We designed them to work inside of these conditions. Okay, real quick, we're wrapping up here. People always ask, what sizes do you make? 210 pints per day is our entry level to our grow optimized dehumidifier. And then we've got 2 300 pint per day models. One if you're running 240, one if you're running 277 volt. It's just the difference between them is strictly that. Some people use the commercial line for their grows. They got 277 going to their lights, and it's easy for them to put dehumidifiers on 277. Some people run 240, and they'd rather put dehumidifiers on 240. We have smaller models for things like drying rooms, smaller grows. If you want some supplemental dehumidification, if you're trying to really crash in those last 2 weeks, bring that dehumidification down even further. These are designed to do just that. 70 pints per day, 95 pints per day, and 130 pints per day. And then brand new are these new F-Series dehumidifiers. They just got released last week. We've been working on them for a while, and they are on heavy-duty casters designed to be simply rolled in, rolled out, and they are at an incredible cost. You will be shocked when you see the cost for one of those dehumidifiers versus the performance you get. Take a peek. Okay, so with that, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, and we're at the end of the webinar, so I will make sure that we answer as many of them as we can. Please visit the Anden website. Take a look at the videos. Hear from other growers across North America about what the difference was when they started working with the Anden team. And again, I cannot stress this enough. This is a team effort here. We're not here to sell you dehumidifiers. We're here to help you understand how to maximize your grow. We have had people use our services and then buy somebody else's equipment. It doesn't bother us. We just want to help everybody inside of the industry. We have expertise and guidance directly from the source. His name is Randy Lenz. You can get a hold of him at any time, and we're always there for you, no matter what you have. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over. We'll answer as many questions as we can, and we'll just see how this goes. So thanks for listening to me, and let's hear about some of these questions that we might have. Anybody got any?
All right. Yeah, we've got a couple here, Brandon. First of all, thanks for that. That was fantastic and very helpful to walk through a number of those sort of common things. I wanted to start off by asking about sort of an audit question, what you first look for when you go into a room. And I'm thinking of the LP in Ontario that you mentioned. I'm thinking of Shango.
Sure.
Of course, you mentioned the 6 quality components toward the end there, which I think maybe addressed part of this question. But when you go into a room with an eye for all these relative humidity concerns and temperature controls, what are some of the first things you're looking for? Does it all start with the location of sensors and things like that, or what are the first steps?
So a lot of it depends on what stage the grow is in. If somebody is just building something, we will actually start designing from the ground up. And that's the most accurate we can make a room, because we will work with their other engineers to understand exactly what the water feed rate is, exactly what the drainage feed rate is, exactly what the type of lights are they're using, what the air conditioning system is. But when we go into any grow, say it's a pre-existing grow like the Shango or like the LP, first thing that we get into that room is the master grower. And we find out from the master grower what it is that they're looking for. What do they think makes good quality product? Because that's really the biggest factor. If somebody's growing a strain, that it's important that the last 2 weeks of dehumidification, or 2 weeks of grow rather, are really hard dehumidification at really cool temperatures, that's going to require a different set of dehumidification needs than somebody who wants to grow at a hotter temperature the entire time. So the master grower has to be involved. Once we understand their method and what they're looking to get out of their environment, and that's not for us to decide, that's for them to decide, we will then do the math to figure out how we need to get there. And we take into account every single factor that we know how to control. We want to understand the size of the room, pretty obvious. We want to understand the amount of lights inside of that room and the kind of lights that are inside of that room, because those are actually a good sanity check against whether or not what the master grower is looking to do is even capable of being done. Okay? Then we need to understand the water feed rate. Once we understand the water feed rate, we got to understand the type of medium that water is being fed into. Is it soil or cocoa inside of a pot? Is it a floating hydroponics bed? Because those things are different when it comes to dehumidifying the room. I'll give you a good example. If you're using a cocoa medium in order to grow your plant, we can drive dehumidification a little harder because we are not drying out that cocoa as fast as if you're using a water table. You can create a vat of redundancy, because if you're drying out more water than the plant's putting out, all you're doing is taking water out of the hydroponics table. And if you're doing that, the hydroponics table has to be refed, and then all of a sudden you're wasting a whole bunch of energy because your dehumidifier is working on overdrive when it doesn't need to. So these things are important to us. Then we need to understand the drainage rate. One of the classic mistakes that people make when sizing a dehumidifier, or just engineering a room in general, is they base everything based upon the water feed rate. And they'll say, oh yeah, we feed, I spoke with a guy this morning who said that they are taking up to 18 gallons per day inside of their indoor grow. Well, excellent, but I guarantee you your plant, unless it's the size of a small city, isn't actually bringing in that much moisture. So we work with them to find out, okay, you're feeding 18 gallons through your grow, but how much of that is going down the drain? How much of that are you recycling? How much of that is going back into the tank? Because if we understand that, now we know how much maximum, again, horticultural knowledge, right? Not just environment knowledge. How much is the maximum amount that plant can absorb? And if we understand how much that plant can absorb, then we understand how much it can transpire. I know this is getting technical, but this is important. Once we understand how much it can transpire, we understand how well we need to size dehumidifiers to keep that room balanced to where that, back to the master grower, wants to be. And then that all ties back to a control. Because if I'm not making sure that the plant, in the microenvironment around the plant, is hitting the numbers that we need it to, we may never flip the VPD in the room. And if we don't flip that VPD, we may never get the plant to actually transpire. And if you can't cause a plant to transpire, you're not allowing it to take up as much nutrient as you want it to. And that's where again, it's a lot of math, it's a lot of questions, it's a lot of answers. But the good news about it is it's all very predictable, and you can tie all that together to really balance out a room. So that was a very long answer, but it has to be, because it's not a simple solution. You can't just say, oh, you've got 20 pints or 20 lights, you need 400 pints of dehumidification. It's just way more to it than that.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to the chocolate cake metaphor, which I'll be thinking about for a while here. I like that. I'm going to sort of blend two questions here together. How do you properly size the dehumidifier if your sensible cooling load is handled by chilled water coils? Or, part B here, are you effectively removing the latent load from the chilled water system at a certain coil surface temperature?
So the answer to that is, again, it's a complicated answer, but there is math behind it. Every single system that we've gone into, we've seen everything from chillers to reheat systems to standard mechanical dehumidification. It all has to do with what type of result you're looking to get. Can a water chiller get as much water out of the air as you need to protect the plant? The answer to that is overwhelmingly yes. They're really well designed. But the question becomes, is the environment that a water chiller needs to create in order to give you that result a positive or a negative for your growth? And for some growth, it was a positive in the summer, because the amount of heat that was coming in through the building, just natural transpiration of heat through the building, was equalizing out the amount of cooling that they were having to do in order to get those water chillers, in order to remove the right amount of humidity. But in the winter, they were noticing they were getting smaller yields. They were getting smaller yields because the temperatures were on average cooler. Even though you may not notice it, your plant does. And that was going to affect the yield. I like water chillers. I think they do a good job. If you're doing acres under a roof, these big, massive greenhouses, they do a great job. The question becomes whether or not they're just doing it the way that you want it to. Things like using reheat systems and water chillers, they are bound by the laws of physics just like mechanical dehumidifiers are. And the reality of the situation is, the only way to get moisture out of the air is to cool the air down and condense it from a gas to a liquid. And if you are having to cool more than you can heat, and your plants are seeing a colder temperature as a result, you're losing yield. Now, flip that. If you have to add heat back into the air in order to prevent that from occurring, now you have created what we lovingly call the Department of Redundancy department, because you're spending money to heat air that you've had to overcool in order to get water out, which at the end of the day defeats the purpose of a water chiller, which is you spend more money up front, but they cost less money to run. Well, everything's a factor when it comes to these. And if you've got to reheat the air in order to compensate for cooling it down too much, that's another problem. So at the end of the day, for some people, they make a lot of sense. And for some people, they don't make a lot of sense. One of the LPs I was just working with yesterday, and I keep saying LPs, I happen to be up in Ontario at the moment. But one of the LPs I was working with yesterday was having a problem with their system. They were trying to use a reheat system. And their reheat system was only giving them about a 5% plus or minus accuracy inside of their grow. And the reason behind that was not that the reheat system wasn't doing its job removing moisture. It was because the byproduct of the reheat system was that they had to add a lot more heat back into their room in order to compensate for the cool that they were using in order to pull the moisture out, which was causing their air conditioner to run, which was causing it to cool, which is causing them to heat, et cetera, et cetera. You can see the pattern developing here, right? So in that room, where they would have otherwise needed, I think it was 300 dehumidifiers, and this was a massive space, we ended up only having to use about 40 dehumidifiers, because the job of the dehumidifier at that point was not to be the major water removal for the entire facility, but it was to make sure that it was removing enough water out of the air so that the reheat system could do the job it was designed to. They marriage really, really well together. Short answer, I have yet to see a grow, regardless of size, where having at least spot dehumidification, a mechanical type dehumidifier, doesn't benefit the entirety of the grow. But you can marry the two, a chiller system with mechanical dehumidification, with a reheat system, and you can really, really get some fantastic results. But it really is based on size. So I know that was a long, again, answer, but again, we're not dealing with simple topics.
Absolutely. And I know we've been dealing with a lot of, the central measurement that we keep coming back to is relative humidity. One attendee was asking what the dew point or absolute humidity that you're maintaining for optimal growth during lights out might be, as far as absolute humidity.
Sure. So the nice thing about it is, if you guys ever want to get really confused, if you want your minds to start spiraling out of control, you can look it up. It's called a psychrometric chart. And on this big psychrometric chart, you can see how relative humidity changes with absolute humidity, changes with temperature. And you can balance that exactly precise based upon what you're looking to do. The answer is going to be kind of disappointing because we never tell a cultivator what their correct absolute humidity is. We know what absolute humidity we need to achieve at what temperature in order to coincide with the correct relative humidity. And our controls do all of that mathematics internally, the ones that we provide for you. And they kick that out to within an accuracy of 1.5%, which is ridiculously good for dehumidifier controls. But everybody's got their own secret sauce. Everybody's got their own, if it grows here, it's the best. And the truth is, everybody we've met has kind of been right. One strain likes at a different absolute humidity at a specific temperature than another strain does. If you're doing a standard growing method versus a sea of green method, as an example, you're changing the humidity levels based upon the needs of the plants and the strains. But we do all the work to calculate that behind the scenes, and it's not something that we do on pen and paper. We've pre-programmed the controls to be able to do that. Our sister company in this, April Air, started making controls that did that back in 1956. And we have perfected that technology along the way. As a matter of fact, we're one of the few companies out there that have a control that has the technology behind it to do all of that digitally, where we just give that to you. And it's not, a lot of companies charge you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for those types of controls because there's a lot that goes into them. But when you are the control manufacturer, you can include things like that inside the box. So there is no correct answer from our point of view as to what the right absolute humidity is. But what we can tell you is what the absolute humidity in the air needs to be in order for you to get the number that you want. And that's where, here's a good example. Believe, one of the LPs up here that we work hand in hand with, inside of their room, we have a dehumidifier and a humidifier, steam humidifier, that are within 0.5% of each other, that never overlap their run, but one shuts off and the other one turns back on because he believes that keeping it this real tight band and gradually lowering that over time is what gives him the absolute best results. And I'm not going to tell you what his numbers were, trade secret for him, right? But we can do that level of accuracy and that level of control to get you there. It's just a matter of finding out what works best for you. And I can tell you this, I will tell you this on the side. I have run into some cultivators that are incredibly right. I've run into an equal amount of cultivators that are incredibly wrong. And we will try to coach you if we see something that doesn't make sense to us. But at the end of the day, it's your choice. You get to decide what that room feels like for your plant. So I hope that makes sense.
That sounds good. As another question, can gasketed filters be used with your dehumidifiers to help reduce condensate contamination?
Can gasketed filters, so off the top of my head, I don't see a reason why they couldn't, but rather than give you a definitive answer, the name that's on the screen, the email address, randy.lenz@anden.com. He is our product specialist. If you email him anytime today, he will have an answer to you within 30 minutes of whether or not it works, or what the effects of it would be.
Good to know. Yes, and please do, everyone, refer to the contact information right there. As another question, is the energy and heat contribution to the grow space from the dehumidifier equivalent to the rated tonnage?
Great question. The answer is, how do you put this? Great question, difficult answer. Every dehumidifier is going to be different. Not every dehumidifier under a certain brand, but an Anden dehumidifier is different than brand X, as an example. If your dehumidifier is using a reheat system, which ours do not, in order to change the way that it gets the relative humidity out of the air, they do that because at face value, it looks like they're more energy efficient. The byproduct of that is more heat coming out of the dehumidifier. So in that answer, the tonnage does not equal the amount of heat that dehumidifier is expelling. And as a result, you need to adjust your air conditioning load in order to compensate for those dehumidifiers. In the case of our dehumidifier, they are pretty close. But to give you a real simple cheat, we've done the math on them. And our 300 pint, our biggest dehumidifier today, outputs the equivalency of 1/2 of 1,000 watt double-ended sodium bulb, which is not enough to affect your air conditioning load at all.
All righty. We've got one last question here from the attendees. Brandon, since CO2 fertilization, the CO2 fertilization effect will tend to increase somatal resistance and improve water use efficiency, do you explicitly take this into effect in the control system?
So our control systems specifically don't get that in depth, the controls themselves. We do tend to take that into account when we work with you to do the calculations, but our controls themselves do not. The control system itself is not taking that to effect. But we can balance, again, math is math, pluses and minuses. We can figure out what the correct percentage is based upon what it is that you're looking to do. So it's an example of where the book might tell you, your idiot's guide to growing cannabis or whatever it is, right? But that might tell you, at this stage you need to crash it down to 52% or 45%. Well, if you're using that method, you may not want to crash that far because you might be robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. You might be bringing the humidity down, which was a plus, but affecting the CO2, which is bad. So we do try to take that into account. There's no perfect method that we have discovered yet. We're working with a lot of different engineers from a lot of different control companies who have been doing agriculture control a lot longer than we have in order to try to get a closer, better method for all. We just haven't gotten there yet. That's the truthful answer behind that.
Well, fair enough. I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. Brandon, of course, I want to thank you as well. That was terrific. And as a reminder to everyone, of course, this webinar will be archived. So keep an eye out in your email inbox in the coming weeks. In the very near future here, we'll be sending this around. so you can review it at your leisure. Again, thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you everybody for taking time out of your day. I know time is money to all of you, so it really means a lot to us that you took the time to listen. Call those numbers, visit those websites. Everything that we offer to you is free of charge as it pertains to sizing and application guidance. Help us help you, and it helps us because we learn as much from you as we can teach. So thank you, everybody.